The 1v1 interview series is a production of the Boss Rush network of podcasts. Visit bossrush.net to listen to our podcast and read our articles, game reviews, and more. You can also follow us on Twitter at Boss Rush Network to stay up to date with our content. Thank you for listening.
Hello everybody, welcome to 1v1 here on Boss Rush Network. I'm your host, the enlightened, excited Eddie B. Joining me from the Turn by Turn podcast. Now everybody, I gotta introduce the special guest properly because he covers, well, him and his co-host Chris covers some of my favorite RPGs. Of course, our elite black agent, Mr. Dan Murphy, has been on the show. He is from 56 Media. That's where Turn by Turn podcast is on. Please welcome the star. There's just not a fantasy. He's the one, the only, Daniel McGarr. Hello, good sir.
Yeah, hey, thanks so much for having me. This is very cool.
Thank you for coming on. I was so excited. We talked on Twitter, and I was telling Daniel that I love his podcast, him and Chris's podcast, because they talk all things JRPG, SRPG, American role-playing games. They started out the show with a top 5 RPG list. And I was just like, y'all coming out hard. But it's so good to meet you, Daniel. Before we get into the show, do you want to introduce who you are and a little bit about the podcast?
Sure. So I'm obviously Daniel, as you so kindly introduced me. So the Turn by Turn podcast has an origin story, actually. So I was doing, I fell in love with RPGs at a young age playing a game called Shining Force that
yes.
One of our listeners will know what that is, and it's like an SRPG, TRPG, and
Sega Genesis.
Yeah.
Yes.
And I wanted to do a podcast, but I wasn't sure what topics would be good, and I found there wasn't a Shining Force one, so I created Shining Pod, which was specifically just Shining Force. And as you can imagine, something with such a small audience, there were not enough people to like create a community to like make that exist long term. So around episode 5, we turned off the lights in the old recording studio and packed up for about a year and a half. And then I still liked the podcast idea, so I wanted to keep it going. So I thought, well, maybe if I just like generalize it to all RPGs, that might be able to find an audience that would be captivated enough to keep it going. So about halfway through the pandemic, I got the podcast itch again. I don't know if that's a real thing, but I got it, and
it is.
And I messaged David Geisler, who is the head of 6.5 and the host of another Zelda podcast.
Yes. Funny thing about him before you go home. Last year, I got to meet him because we did another Zelda podcast. We did the quiz show in the summer with Celeste and Stephanie and just a whole bunch of people, even Dan. And it was a good way to meet everybody. We were having a barbecue at his house. And we literally had a conversation about Zelda that could have been a 1-hour podcast. I now know that when I talk to David, you might as well just start recording because we're going to talk. But go ahead. I'm sorry.
Yeah. David is a really awesome guy.
He is.
I was hoping to do with Shining Pod what he had done with another Zelda podcast, but audiences being what they are, there is a Zelda audience. There's not really a Shining Force audience. So sort of feathered out, and then like I was saying, halfway through the pandemic, I just out of the blue decided I would message him on Twitter, hey, I have this idea for a show. do you want it? Or like, would you want to produce it? And it just so happened to be like a perfect gap in their schedule for how they release their shows. So he said yes. And then my co-host for Shining Pod didn't really have the time to commit to playing other RPGs enough to talk about them. So during its long tenure of existence, Shining Pod, I had Chris on as a guest, being the other Shining Force fan in the world.
Mm-hmm.
So I had reached out to him saying, hey, would you want to do this? And thankfully he said yes, and now we're a podcast.
All right, awesome. Everybody know Shining Force is a strategy role-playing game by Sega. The 1 and 2, I believe, came on Sega Genesis around 1993. That's 93, 94. And they were more popular in Japan than it was in America, because we didn't have strategy games like this. Fire Emblem really didn't come here until the Game Boy Advance. Yeah, about the Game Boy Advance it came in. So Sega kind of beat them with the strategy role-playing game on console. And it just took a while for it, because we was waiting for Shining Force 3 to come, and it never came. Most of the series is still in Japan that everybody want.
It's funny because as a series, after Shining Force 3, and then they did these other games called like the Gaiden series.
Yes.
Like the Sword of Hagia and Final Conflict. And after those, they sort of like took the playbook and like threw it out the window and started making other games. Like there's like there's a couple dungeon crawlers. There's like totally unrelated like style of games, but there's like this very like loosely weaved narrative beyond the games. So there's like Shining Force Feather and like Shining Force Exa, and like some of them are just sort of rehashes of the original games with like different styles. But it's very strange where that series goes, and it gets more like data sim, kind of like how Fire Emblem like has added in more like dating and things as the series progresses.
Yes.
So it's really fascinating that they still use like the same like franchise tag for these other games that are coming out that seem so distantly related. They might as well be something separate.
Well, can I ask you, were you looking at a lot of Sega RPGs back in the day, or currently, or anything? Like, do you ever get a feeling that you would like to know the history of the RPGs series that was on Sega and their consoles?
Mm-hmm. I think the Sega and like the Super Nintendo house some of the best RPGs. I don't know. Yeah. Is that like a hot take? I don't know.
Well, because the Sega, when I said Phantasy Star was kind of problematic because it didn't have a map in that game. And it was first person, and you literally, as a kid, you would have to draw everything, or you literally had to call the Sega hotline system, and they would send you a map so you could get through the game. Because it was so difficult. They didn't really plan it. And I know definitely for me as a kid, of course, I knew the Legend of Zelda series, of course, but I didn't get to play Final Fantasy or Dragon Quest or anything like that. A lot of the Square RPGs I didn't really get to play. I even played Gauntlet in the arcade and on the NES, but that was kind of a different RPG. So when the Sega Genesis and Super Nintendo came, Squaresoft were the big people on Super Nintendo, with a little bit of Nintendo themselves, and also Enix. But Sega was doing a lot. And then when Sega CD came out, you had Working Design that dropped. So you had Lunar, you had this magical game, and I cannot think of it, but Working Designs was the Squaresoft of the Sega Genesis era. Mm-hmm. But you had like Phantasy Star 2, 3, and 4. No,
4, I believe.
Yeah, it was
like
Sega
Phantasy
Genesis.
Star Online, sort of that like weird. I think it started at like the GameCube.
It's the GameCube and Genesis and Sega Dreamcast, I think. I
That
believe.
sounds right.
Yeah. But they also had like Beyond Oasis, which was like a top-down RPG, action style RPG, which we're going to get into because I definitely have to get your take on why The Legend of Zelda isn't considered as an RPG, but a game. And I don't know if you heard of this game called Alundra on PS1.
Sounds familiar, but I don't think I haven't played it.
So Alundra was this game where you were like you would get into people's dreams, and their dreams were actual dungeons and everything. But because it came from working design, people called it an action RPG. Mm-hmm. But it's kind of designed the same way as the Zelda games.
Okay, sure.
So but we'll get a little bit later into that. So, but then I kind of want to ask you, how did you get into video games?
So, my first video games, to age myself maybe a little bit, I don't know. I'm 30, so we had the original Game Boys growing up, and the first game I really remember playing beyond Tetris was Link's Awakening.
Yes.
Yeah. Did you play that when it was originally coming out?
Mm-hmm. I had it on the original Game Boy, and then I had it on Game Boy Color. So I'm 41. So I grew up during part of the Atari, Nintendo, Sega ages. So I was the Nintendo kid. So of course I had to get all the Nintendo consoles and handhelds. So, but Link's Awakening, yes, I own both copies of that game as a kid.
Mm-hmm. That's such a great game.
It is.
It is really fun, but it can be pretty difficult because I was playing when I was like 6 or 7, so following it was always pretty tough.
I think once I learned about The Legend of Zelda, A Link to the Past, and then seeing this like the same gameplay for Link's Awakening, I understood what it was, but I didn't know what that game really was about until I started getting stuff. I'm just like, this is such a good game to play on the go.
It's definitely one of those like head scratchers, like what is happening type games.
Yeah, because I never understood. I'm like, why am I collecting musical instruments and not the Triforce? I was so used to collecting the Triforce parts, but I started realizing that they were taking the Zelda series into a whole different direction.
Mm-hmm. And I think that's what's interesting about it when it was released. And we can get back to RPGs. I like to rant.
What that's a boss rush.
That when it came out, it was a first Zelda game for so many people that it twisting the Zelda formula is just so funny that so many people cite it as their first game, and their first game was a twist on the genre already.
Yes, and I don't want to ruin the ending for it, but it kind of connected a little bit to Super Mario Brothers 2, and I didn't realize it till I actually completed Link's Awakening. So I'm gonna leave it there. I'll let you guys figure that out. If you haven't played it, it's available I love the Switch version. Oh, that version is amazing. My mouth was just agape throughout playing that whole thing. I'm just like, this is the remake that is just phenomenal, and it just stands out,
Mm-hmm. Do you think it's a better remake than Final Fantasy VII?
Yes, actually.
Oh yeah?
Yeah. And I'm gonna tell you why. I think they captured the spirit of it, and it looks just beautiful in motion. And Final Fantasy VII Remake feels too much like a movie, while they try to add a lot of stuff but change it, while still, because fighting that house as a boss in that arena, I paused the game and I screamed and yeah, I have tweets on it cracking up to be like, why am I fighting this big house as a boss? And it took me an hour to beat him. I was like, this is literally insane. Like it literally turned into a Kingdom Hearts battle. And I was just like, this wasn't a boss in the game. This was a regular enemy that, you could grind and fight and stuff. But I'm like, I'm fighting these, these things going through this arena battle, and a mechanical house comes out. I'm like, what is this nonsense? And then half of my magic wasn't working against it. So I'm just like, great. I can't Devil May Cry these mugs. I gotta, it's taking all my energy off because the shop system is a mess. Like I'm like, you're not prepared for what that game was. And I'm playing on normal for Final Fantasy Remake. I beat it already, but I was just like, okay, I understand the delays and everything, but this is just too. I understand the high quality of the production and everything, but this is just overdoing it. And I feel like Link's Awakening on Switch was just so complete and perfect that, they still were able to add new elements, clean up some things, but it still felt engaging like you played the original version or the DX version on Game Boy Color. So it had, I think the Legend of Zelda Link's Awakening had more heart to it than Final Fantasy Remake had heart. Final Fantasy VII Remake really just felt like action-packed, high production that just, it went for visuals and nothing else. And I think that doesn't do enough where Link's Awakening is just, I guess, felt more comforting, more enjoyable to do.
My thought on the Final Fantasy VII Remake is it just feels so smooth.
Yes.
Like it does have that like animated movie quality about it, where it's like hyper realistic and everything is just perfect.
But then it drags out that perfection. We're just like, okay, we can end this fight. No, I got a fifth form that I'm about to do before. Wait, a fifth form? I'm like, come on now.
That feels very Final Fantasy, though. To like give you like 17 of like kind of the same thing, but a little different. Like even with just like random encounters where like you might like be walking for about 2 minutes and have like 34 encounters. Like that's like part of the experience of Final Fantasy is like getting bogged down on something that should be rather simple and doing it for 2 hours straight.
Yeah. So, but that's my take on it. I'm sorry.
No.
So do you think Final Fantasy VII Remake was better than Link's Awakening?
I haven't played the Link's Awakening remake.
Ooh, yes, you need to play it.
It interests me because it does have that weird like Snoopy sort of look to it. That Peanuts movie that came out, it looks exactly like that. With like,
we called it someone called it Zelda Mobile because like the Playmobil toys. Did you know Playmobil?
Oh, I know Playmobil.
Okay. I was to say, I'm like, you don't know Playmobil? Yeah, they called it Zelda Mobile graphics. So like, that is so true with that Charlie Brown peanut.
The giant eyes and like the oblong faces.
So, well, I kind of want to ask you, how did you get into RPGs and more so since the turn RPGs? Because that is, turn by turn, that is kind of like a traditional role-playing game mechanic in RPGs or JRPGs when we think about it. But there's more to it.
So, I don't stray far from the homeland. So, it's all started with Shining Force.
Okay.
And so I had a like one of those really old like Windows like 95 like early Dell 2000 computers, and I had bought the Sega Smash Pack that had wildly great hits like Shining Force and Chameleon Kid, Combat Zone.
Yeah.
It was like a 12-in-1 game sort of system. So I
probably played like 10 of those games on there. I remember Combat Zone. Oh goodness, that game.
That game's hard.
It is.
And as a kid, didn't really appeal. So I kept trying the different games, and then I had tried Phantasy Star 2, and that felt like something made in like Microsoft Paint at the time. So that didn't really catch on. And so then I played Shining Force, and I loved like finding all the weird characters and that you could go along and you could get like a weaponized like armadillo, and like it somehow fit. But in like Fire Emblem or different things like that, it's mostly a human cast, and you might have like an occasional dragon. In Shining Force, like you never know what's going to end up being like a partner for you. So
True. Yes.
It had a lot of appeal that way, to the point where I actually hadn't played much Fire Emblem because I was just so into the Shining Force that I hadn't bothered to try it. And Chris got me playing the Fire Emblem games, so I've been sort of binging those. But I really love the tactical map games, so that stuff always appeals. Like, I love the idea of Final Fantasy Tactics, Tactic Ogre, all those like top-down sort of games where you get like a very peculiar cast of people. So
it just, well, I kind of I was wondering this because like tactical RPGs were in a sense, sorry about that. Tactical RPGs in a sense were kind of not pretty big, kind of like in the 90s and early 2000s. You know, it was the two, like when Final Fantasy VII came out, that RPGs became a big thing for America with JRPGs, because it was literally such a niche genre until Final Fantasy VII came out. Even though like a lot of us knew about Chrono Trigger and Secret of Mana and Earthbound and all of these games, a lot of people didn't get on board with them because they were too to them they were too challenging. They didn't know the mechanics and everything. So I kind of want to ask you, can you easily grasp the mechanics of an RPG in a sense nowadays than you think you would have in the olden days?
Yeah, the tagline, the unofficial tagline of the show is that I suck at gaming. So for a long time, no. Now that I've started like playing them all the time, every waking second for the show, yes, I pick it up pretty quick now. Every once in a while, there'll be something funny. Like in Bravely Default 2, getting used to that default in Brave commands. That took a little bit of getting used to, but once I got it, I figured it out. And then if you grind enough, you can just Brave 3 times with all your people, and then you don't have to even like strategize at all. But a lot of the older games, like you were saying, like Earthbound, those games are incredibly difficult, and even just knowing where to go and what to do are so, it is not remotely obvious sometimes what you're supposed to do in those older ones.
So earlier RPGs, they have this kind of difficulty curve to them. You know, Final Fantasy 3/6 was kind of a good one to understand, but you know, you didn't have the Bravely Default kind of gameplay. You didn't have the Chrono Trigger kind of gameplay. You literally had turn after turn. You know, enemy went, my character went back and forth and everything. And Dragon Quest or Dragon Warrior back in the day on the NES, that took more grinding to get through and everything. What do you think of classic RPGs compared to modern RPGs?
I think they seed in a lot more hints nowadays than if you're just sitting playing Earthbound for an hour. You might not get very far because you just have no idea how to get the plot to go forward. But with things nowadays, it's like, oh, you should go check out that closet in the south building downtown. And then like it has built-in hints now, whereas before it was pretty brutal, of like almost on the level of like the original Legend of Zelda game, where you're just walking around kind of looking for something to happen.
Well, yeah, because I think nowadays you got a lot of cutscenes to progress the story. You know, you still got that grinding mechanic, but like you'd have got something like Chrono Trigger, where in order to really progress in that story, you got to time jump to that era. And then it gets to a point where you're time jumping everywhere before you actually get it to the end. Because in a sense, Chrono Trigger was kind of the first evolution of role playing games. It was mixing traditional RPG with some action to it because you were able to see the enemy instead of just warping in and everything. What did you think of Chrono Trigger and the new game plus? Like how that become a staple in the industry. Were you surprised that it came from there?
I don't think so, because I feel like Chrono Trigger holds up phenomenally well.
Mm-hmm.
And it's always sort of the gold standard of what like an RPG or even just a video game in general can be, because
Yes.
it has so many like modern things they push in games now that you can tell every game was inspired by it, because Chrono Trigger has, I think, 13 and separate potential endings. So that's what you're seeing in a lot of RPGs now. Like Triangle Strategy that I just played has like 4 endings.
Mm-hmm.
And then Three Houses has like 47 different potential endings. So it just seems like it set the bar so high that just everybody imitates it now. Even in our season 2 of Turn by Turn, we've been talking to some game devs about their games, and everybody mentions Chrono Trigger and they mention Final Fantasy. So setting the bar so high that it's just like imitation is the most sincere form of flattery. So I couldn't be happier.
Yeah, it's something, because I think I mentioned to you there's a game called Elemental Gimmick Gear on Dreamcast.
Mm-hmm.
And it's such a it's in that vein of Zelda, in that vein of Elantra, where it's an action RPG, and you find these pieces, but you're a robot. You're a guy in this robot who lands on this planet, and you're trying to find out what's going on, what happened. But there's a thing that you could turn yourself into an egg. That's why it's called Elemental Gimmick Gear Egg. And you spin around, and that could be part of your attack. But there are parts that to open up a door, you have to land down and spin. So there's like some kind of offbeat RPGs. But it kind of reminds me of like Secret of Mana and Chrono Trigger, like in this graphics in a way that it looked and everything. So it's kind of, when I think definitely with me being on Boss Rush, being like the old time gamer playing almost everything, I look at Chrono Trigger as a game that I think it started off a lot of discussions about how RPG should be discussed and kind of design. And then you see elements in other genres and everything. Did you kind of get, not upset, but did you kind of get rid of out that games that use RPG elements to it not considered as an RPG?
I don't think it really bothers me. I think it's pretty flattering that the games I like are so incredibly good, everybody has to steal from them.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that part of it I really like.
But I wonder if people would be like, oh, okay, I like this wildlife RPG from Ghost Recon, whatever, Wildlands, I'm sorry, from Recon. But do you think that's just like, okay, you love this RPG mechanic, would you try something like, let's say, The World Is With You?
Mm-hmm.
You know, and people still would sometimes be like, no, that's just too nerdy to say. Do you kind of find that weird that they would play a game with those elements but not actually go into the genre playing?
So like your fringe RPGs, like the world ends with you is an RPG, but it's like kind of like a head tilt RPG where you have to squint to see it be an RPG, because it does have those, like you pick your different pins, but you're just sort of flailing around on the screen.
Yeah.
And
okay,
we're going to be talking The World Ends With You at some point.
Okay. I fear. I got to get the one on Switch so I could play. I heard it's bad, but I I got the Sega version, the new game, but I gotta start it. And I want to get the first game because I haven't played it on the DS. I kind of want to see what this all about. Now, do we talk about Kingdom Hearts? Because I don't know if you are interested in playing that series.
I haven't played any Kingdom Hearts. It's always interested me because it's like the Disney game.
Mm-hmm. Did you think Square Enix went kind of off the handle with that series by putting like most of the main story on Nintendo consoles and pretty much part of it on PlayStation, even though PlayStation is the leading console for that series? Well, now it's on Xbox and Switch, but like, did you think? Because I've never known a RPG that would have about 13 or 50 some games, and it is complete nonsense of a story.
Mm-hmm. That's always sort of been the turnoff of why I haven't tried it, because it's just like, what even is it? Like, it's the game where you can run around as Mickey Mouse sometimes, but beyond that, like, does it really classify as like a full RPG? Like,
I mean,
is it like?
I mean, it has armor in it. It has a battle system that, like, that you can level up. Like, it has those elements that make it a JRPG, like an action style. But it's kind of just like it's so weird because the story is problematic in a sense because it's so confusing that you're playing the way that the way that they jumped around in that story to understand it completely when it's full. You got to play all the games because part of the story that there's a game, I think it's 352 over 2 days, that is running alongside Chain of Memories, which is a game on Game Boy. And then that leads it to Kingdom Hearts 2. But it's just like, wait a minute. You just made this out of the blue to go into Kingdom Hearts 2. And Kingdom Hearts 2 had already been out by then. So it's kind of weird on how and then you can't really understand how everything actually started until you play the one on PSP. And it's just like, this is nonsense of a story, like, on how this game is designed. But with the collection, you could go in order. But like, does that confuse you? In a sense?
Definitely. I know that it feels like the Legend of Zelda timeline is you get sort of like, oh, there's like the 3 possible solutions, and if you play this one, you're on the fallen hero track, and then this one you're like the greatest hero track. And it always seems like video games have a really, really hard time keeping continuity, especially when you get past, say, 5 games. That a lot of RPGs feel like they control the narrative a little better until you get to that like 5th or 6th game, and then it's just totally random. And like, they want the continuity to match because they want to keep releasing games with the same mechanic styles, but then they have to introduce time travel. Like, I know Fire Emblem has some pretty wacky time travel, like earth switching mechanics when it gets to like Fates and Awakening. And
yeah,
it just, I don't know why it's so hard for them to balance it. But like, the Marvel Cinematic Universe is like 27 movies or something. And it's like there's like nitpicking and stuff, but generally it follows a pretty straightforward narrative. And then you get video games that reach game 5 and it's like they just have no idea how to keep it going or change it.
Has there ever been a RPG story that just let you finish it, you put the controller down and been like, what the world was that?
That feels like an Earthbound thing. Right?
Yes.
Where it's like, okay.
Like, what was the plot of this thing?
Yeah. I feel like summarize Earthbound is a very hard question.
It's Kingdom Hearts for me. Like, I understood the first one. I'm like, okay, this is good. I love what they're going with. And then when it just started to get into the other games, I'm like, what the world is this? Yeah. Monster Hunter, something like that from Capcom. Because I think we haven't touched on the Capcom RPGs like Breath of Fire and Monster Hunter and stuff. What do you think of those kind of RPGs?
So, depending on when this episode comes out, we have a Monster Hunter episode coming out pretty soon. So, keep an eye out for that. It was actually it's Monster Hunter Rise that I played, and it was actually my first in the series. And it was an episode that Chris wanted to do. So, again, the joke is that Chris is the brains of the show, and I just like have the mic on to say yep and So it's always fun when there's Chris episodes because I get to yeah, that sounds about right. But with Monster Hunter Rise, I thought it was a fantastic game. I had a lot of fun playing it. I love that you get a cat and a dog. I think we were talking about that on Twitter a little bit one day.
I think so, yeah. Because I love the fact that your Palico and your Palidog, your Palamute, they could be in different outfits. And then when you get the Amaterasu from Okami as your Palamute, I was just like, that's so cool. I love this and everything. I thought that was like really cool for that. I know for me, when it comes to Capcom titles and the Legend of Zelda season, Oracles and Seasons and stuff like that were really good. But I love Breath of Fire 3. I think that is still to this day one of their best RPGs today. Saga Frontier is Squaresoft. Oh, that game is just good googly moogly. No. So, because you haven't been to the PlayStation 1 RPGs yet, like their lineup, because you haven't played Beyond the Beyond or anything.
No.
Okay, so there is a quest that you get with and I do not like Beyond the Beyond. I can tell you that. There's a quest that you get a character and he's automatically poisoned. And you have to try to get through, I think, about 5 or 6 hours of the game to get the item to stop him from poisoning. So he could die. Every time you resurrect him or anything, because you can't use no antidote or anything, you can't heal him or anything, he continues to have poison until you get it off of him as a quest. So I was just like, you don't make an RPG like this or anything. So I just let him die. I just kept him as a dead person in my party because I couldn't switch him out with anybody. I kept him as a dead person in my party until I got to that point, and I was just like, I got 3 more hours before I actually get to heal him to get rid of it, and I just stopped playing the game. I never went back to that game.
Yeah, it can be pretty defeating if you get stuck with something weird like that. It's always nicer when you have, like, the Fire Emblem games always give you like a super character at the beginning to kind of help you balance the power while you're getting the other mechanics together. So I think it's always nice when they throw you a bone and give you a little something rather than making all your characters level 1, like 1 hits. So,
well, is there an RPG that you are fascinated and or interested that you want to play?
So Tactics Ogre is a big one that I want to play, and then I want to play more of the Dragon Quest games. There's a lot. I've been playing through Super Mario RPG, and that's been weirdly fun.
Oh, nice.
In ways that I wouldn't think. So
what do you think of Western RPGs, like games like Fallout and Dragon Age and Mass Effect?
So I actually haven't played Mass Effect, but
okay,
that's another one of Chris's favorites. But I think it's good. I think it usually feels very obvious that it's a Western game. And from what Chris has told me, Mass Effect is pretty weird story too.
Yeah, it is, but I think even though whatever the story may be or how you take it, I think it's the moral choices that you do make and it's the characters that you come about. Because I think the cast of the Mass Effect games is really good. For RPG that it is, American RPG, the cast is super strong. I think you will find some favorites if you decide to ever give it a try. Now, do you do a lot of PC kind of RPGs or do you do console and PC?
It's mostly console. So I have a Mac computer, which means I don't get any good games pretty much. So most of the gaming happens like on my Switch or emulated.
Or we call it other ways.
Yes.
Yes.
Other ways.
Other ways. Well, we don't got much time, and I'm gonna let you go because you probably just got home from work. I know you want to eat and stuff. One of my favorite questions to ask everybody is just like, what is your favorite cereal or your favorite snack or anything while gaming or getting ready for work or anything?
Favorite snack. That's a good one. I always enjoy your Snacktendo sections on PAL Block.
Thank you.
I'm a big pastry guy. I like donuts and stuff. Probably more than I should.
Okay, so do you guys consider called the Long Johns something else? It's the long donut with the frosting at the top.
Mm-hmm.
Did you guys call them Long Johns?
Yeah, those are amazing.
Okay,
because they're bigger, so it's more satisfying as well.
Did you get them at like a grocery store, or did you got like a certain donut shop outside of Dunkin'?
It's mostly Dunkin' up here. I'm in New England, so it's pretty much only Dunkin'.
Okay.
It's a lot of Dunkin'. And Dunkin' Donuts are not like a top tier donut.
Mm-hmm.
They're like the donut in a pinch, which is generally like what I'm in. So I settle a lot, but there's probably a lot of really good homespun donuts nearby.
Is there a specialty snack found only in New England that you like?
So there's these. I don't think it's New England only, but whoopie pies are amazing.
Ooh.
That's like for those who don't know, I feel like most people might know at this point, but for those who don't, it's basically like a cake base with like a diabetes amount of frosting in the middle, and then like a cake top.
Oh wow!
Kind of like smushed together into like a burger. And a lot of the homemade ones of those are really good.
Did you drink it like with milk or ice cream, or do you like a milkshake or?
Yeah, you could do that. You could like feel your heart slow. So, those are pretty good. New England is also pretty known for their pie, which having eaten a lot of local pie, there's some really good pie up here.
Like what, like apple pie, lemon pie? Is there kind of...
So apple or blueberry are your two key pies in New England.
Really?
Mm-hmm. Probably more blueberry than apple.
Why blueberry?
We have a lot of blueberry fields up here. So they're pretty readily accessible. So you have like fresh berries, which always make for a better pie.
Mm-hmm.
So you can get some really good pie up here.
I need to make it. Let me write that down. New England trip snacks blueberry pie.
Yeah, like if you're, I don't know why you would be or why anyone would be, but some of like the small little towns in Maine have like the best pie you'll ever have in your entire life.
The pie that will put you to sleep.
Exactly. Like
when you wake up and there's that one little crumb in the side of your mouth.
Exactly. So like if you can't find the town on Google Maps, they probably have the best pie possible. If they're off the grid, their pie is going to be amazing is sort of the rule.
Exactly. Well, Daniel, I want to thank you for joining me for this discussion. Can let people know where can they find the podcast and find you?
Yeah, so you can find the podcast on on wherever podcasts are sold as the Turn by Turn Podcast. And you can follow our random happenings on Twitter at the Turn by Turn Pod. For me specifically, I'm less interesting than, because I basically run the Turn by Turn Twitter, so I'm more on that for gaming stuff. But if you want my personal one, you can find me at McGarr Mentions to see what things I've been mentioning. But again, I tend to be more observant than vocal on that one. So
okay. And you guys can find me on Twitter at that retro code. You can check more of 1v1 at Boss Rush Network on our website, bossrush.net, and on our YouTube page on Boss Rush Network. You may hear me on a future Turn by Turn episode. I'm trying to get on so I could talk about Secret of Mana. And if Konami ever releases Suikoden, I could come on to talk about Suikoden was the game back in the day. So, but with that, everybody, have a great week. Have a great weekend. Thank you, Daniel, for coming on, talking all things RPG. And everybody, check out the Turn by Turn podcast. If you want to learn about RPGs or you want to see what these guys think about them, tune in and hear them out. They have some great episodes. They are in season 2 at this moment, but you could go back and listen all to season 1 also. With that, everybody, have a great weekend. Have a great week. Whenever you listen to the podcast. And we'll see you next time on 1v1. Bye, everybody.
Bye. Thanks so much for having me.
You're welcome.
It was a lot of fun.